The mountain rescue team found Sarah Mitchell collapsed in the snow, her body temperature dropping to fatal levels, but her German Shepherd Ranger refused to let them near her until she whispered something that made the lead paramedic's blood run cold. "I found him. I found my daddy." It wasn't hypothermia talking. Clutched in her frozen fingers were genuine World War II dog tags. The rescue helicopter pilot nearly crashed when Ranger suddenly bolted toward a hidden canyon, barking frantically at something the crew couldn't see. Through the swirling snow, they glimpsed the impossible. The tail section of an ancient bomber jutting from a pristine mountain lake like a metallic gravestone. Sarah's mother had died 3 years ago, taking the secret of her father's identity to the grave, leaving only a faded photograph and 40 years of unanswered questions. Now this loyal dog had somehow led her to what looked like the answer, frozen in time. "Get the recovery team up here now," the pilot radioed, his voice shaking as he stared at the wreckage. What had this woman and her dog discovered in that forgotten canyon? And why did it feel like they'd just awakened something that was meant to stay buried forever? Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments along with the city you're watching from now. Let's continue with the story. 6 months before that life-changing discovery in the Colorado mountains, Sarah Mitchell sat in her cramped cabin kitchen, staring at a stack of overdue bills that seemed to multiply like weeds. At 52, the former Army medic survived on a meager disability check of $1,247 a month, while her mortgage demanded $2,100. The math was brutal and unforgiving, just like the mountain winters that crept through the gaps in her weathered cabin walls. The only photograph she owned of her father sat propped against a chipped coffee mug on the kitchen table. A young pilot in World War II uniform smiled back at her with "William" scrawled in her mother's fading handwriting on the back. For 40 years, that single word had been her only clue to the man who had given her life, but never stayed to watch her live it. Her mother, Margaret, had taken every other secret to her grave 3 years ago, leaving Sarah with nothing but questions that gnawed at her soul like an infected wound. Ranger lifted his massive German Shepherd head from his favorite spot by the wood stove, amber eyes tracking Sarah's restless movements with the intensity that had once made him invaluable to soldiers in Afghanistan. The 4-year-old dog bore invisible scars just like Sarah did. His previous handler, Sergeant Davies, had died in the same IED explosion that had cost Ranger partial hearing in his left ear, and left him with a violent fear of thunder that matched Sarah's own battle with PTSD. The military retirement program had brought them together 2 years ago, 2 broken warriors learning to heal in the thin mountain air of Colorado. Sarah had chosen this isolated cabin 20 miles outside the tiny town of Creekwood, specifically because it was far from the noise and chaos that triggered her nightmares. Here, surrounded by towering pines and endless silence, she could pretend the war had never happened, and that her father might still walk through the door someday. But isolation came with a price. Sarah's part-time job at the local hardware store barely covered groceries, and the bank's foreclosure letters were becoming more frequent and more threatening. She had exactly 3 months before losing the only home she'd ever truly loved, the place where she and Ranger had slowly stitched their damaged souls back together. Ranger suddenly stood, his ears rotating toward the window like satellite dishes. Sarah followed his gaze to see storm clouds building over the peaks, dark and heavy with the promise of violence. The Weather Service had issued warnings about a severe thunderstorm system moving through the area, complete with damaging winds and hail. Sarah reached for Ranger's comfort vest, the specially designed garment that helped calm his storm anxiety, but the dog was already pacing nervously, his claws clicking against the worn wooden floors. Neither of them could have imagined that this approaching storm would set in motion a chain of events that would finally answer the questions that had haunted Sarah her entire life, or that a terrified dog's flight into the wilderness would lead them both to the most important discovery in American military history. The first crack of thunder split the September afternoon like a rifle shot, and Ranger's world exploded into chaos. Sarah watched helplessly as her four-legged companion transformed from a calm, steady presence into a trembling mass of terror. His amber eyes went wide with panic, pupils dilated, and the low whine that escaped his throat carried the weight of every battlefield memory that haunted his damaged psyche. "Easy, boy," Sarah whispered, reaching for his thunder vest hanging by the door. But she was too late. Lightning illuminated the cabin windows in a stark white flash, followed immediately by another earth-shaking boom that seemed to rattle the very foundations of their small world. Ranger bolted. The screen door stood no chance against 80 pounds of panicked German Shepherd. Ranger crashed through it like it was made of paper, sending splinters of wood and twisted metal flying across the porch. Sarah lunged after him, her own heart hammering against her ribs as she watched her best friend disappear into the wall of rain that had suddenly engulfed the mountainside. "Ranger, come back!" Her voice was swallowed by the howling wind before it could travel 20 feet. The storm had arrived with the sudden violence that mountain weather was famous for, transforming the peaceful afternoon into a maelstrom of driving rain, hail, and winds that bent the massive pines like drinking straws. Sarah grabbed her rain jacket and emergency flashlight, her military training overriding her civilian caution. She'd been in worse conditions in Afghanistan, she told herself, though that was a lie, and she knew it. This wasn't a war zone with backup and medical support, just a radio call away. This was the Colorado wilderness, where people disappeared for weeks before search teams found their remains, if they found them at all. The first day of searching passed in a blur of exhaustion and growing panic. Sarah called in sick to her part-time job at Mitchell's Hardware, lying to her boss Frank about having the flu. She couldn't afford to lose any work hours, not with the foreclosure notice sitting on her kitchen table like a ticking bomb, but she also couldn't abandon Ranger. The dog was her family, her anchor, the only living being who understood the nightmares that visited her sleep and the sudden panic attacks that could strike without warning. She searched every trail within a 5-mile radius of the cabin, calling his name until her voice was raw and broken. Ranger's military training should have brought him home by now. He'd been taught to return to base, to find his handler no matter the circumstances. The fact that he hadn't filled Sarah with a dread that went deeper than mere worry, something was wrong, terribly wrong. By the second day, Sarah's rational mind was losing the battle against desperation. She'd expanded her search radius to 10 miles, pushing deeper into unmarked wilderness than she'd ever ventured before. Her emergency supplies were running low, her water nearly gone, and her smartphone had lost signal somewhere around dawn. The Colorado mountains were beautiful and peaceful when viewed from a cabin window, but they were also vast and unforgiving to the unprepared. "Everyone I love leaves or dies," she whispered to the empty forest, her voice barely audible above the wind sighing through the pines. It was a truth that had defined her life. Her father disappearing before she was born, her mother taking secrets to the grave, her fellow soldiers cut down by IEDs and sniper fire, and now Ranger, lost somewhere in thousands of acres of wilderness that could hide a dog's body for decades. The third day brought Sarah to the edge of physical and emotional collapse. She'd missed 2 days of work now, which meant 2 days of lost wages she couldn't afford. The mortgage payment was due in a week, and she was already $300 short. Without Ranger, without her job, without her cabin, what did she have left? The question echoed in her mind as she stumbled through underbrush that tore at her jeans and left bloody scratches on her hands. She was preparing to turn back, to admit defeat and call the county sheriff to report Ranger officially missing, when she heard it. a single bark, distant but unmistakable, echoing off the canyon walls somewhere ahead. Sarah's heart leaped into her throat as she crashed through a stand of young aspens, following the sound with renewed energy she didn't know she still possessed. There, standing on a rocky outcrop about 50 yards away, was Ranger. But he wasn't coming to her. Instead, the dog looked back once, his intelligent eyes meeting hers across the distance, and then deliberately turned and trotted away into terrain she'd never seen before. He paused, looked back again, and barked once more. The message was clear. Follow me. After 48 hours of hell, Sarah would have followed Ranger anywhere. What she didn't know was that her loyal companion was about to lead her to a discovery that would change everything she thought she knew about her father, her family, and herself. Ranger led Sarah through terrain that seemed to exist outside the normal world, a landscape so hidden and pristine that she wondered if human eyes had ever seen it before. The dog moved with purpose now, his earlier panic replaced by an almost supernatural certainty. He would trot ahead about 20 yards, pause to ensure Sarah was following, then continue down what appeared to be an ancient game trail, worn smooth by generations of deer and elk. The path descended steadily, winding between massive granite boulders that had tumbled from the peaks eons ago. Sarah's legs trembled with exhaustion, but something in Ranger's behavior kept her moving. This wasn't random wandering. The dog was taking her somewhere specific, somewhere important. His ears were up, alert, and his tail held the confident position she recognized from his military working days. After what felt like hours but was probably only 30 minutes, the narrow trail opened into something that took Sarah's breath away. She found herself standing at the rim of a hidden canyon, a geological bowl carved from living rock and hidden from the world above by a natural roof of interlocking stone formations. It was as if the mountain had kept a secret for millennia, and Ranger had somehow discovered the key. The canyon floor lay about 60 feet below, accessible by a steep but manageable slope on the far side. A small alpine lake filled most of the space, its surface so still and dark it looked like polished obsidian. Ancient pines grew along the water's edge, their roots finding purchase in the thin soil that had accumulated over countless seasons. The entire hidden world was maybe 200 yards across, intimate and sacred, untouched by the modern world that existed just beyond the canyon walls. But what made Sarah's heart stop wasn't the natural beauty of the place. It was what rested in the water near the far shore. The tail section of an aircraft rose from the lake like a metallic monument, its vertical stabilizer piercing the surface at a steep angle. Even from her elevated position, Sarah could see that this was no small plane. The sheer size of the visible wreckage suggested something massive, something military. Ranger sat beside her, panting softly, and looked up at her with an expression that seemed to say, "This is what I wanted to show you." Sarah's military training kicked in as she studied the scene below. The aircraft appeared to be a World War II-era bomber, based on the configuration of the tail and the style of the markings she could barely make out through decades of weathering. How had it gotten here? This canyon was nowhere near any flight path she knew of, and certainly not on any route that a 1940s bomber would have taken. Working her way carefully down the slope, Sarah felt her pulse quickening with each step. Ranger bounded ahead, splashing into the shallow water at the lake's edge without hesitation. As Sarah got closer, more of the aircraft became visible beneath the surface. The fuselage was largely intact, tilted at about a 45-degree angle with the nose buried deep in the lake bottom. One wing was completely submerged, while the other had broken off and lay scattered in pieces along the shoreline. The water was shockingly cold as Sarah waded in, but adrenaline kept her moving. She could see into the broken section of the fuselage through a large rent in the aluminum skin. Emergency flares and life preservers floated in the cabin space, preserved by the cold mountain water. And there, just visible in the murky interior, were the unmistakable shapes of human remains. Sarah's breath caught in her throat. This wasn't just a historical artifact. This was a tomb. She pulled out her waterproof phone and began taking pictures, documenting everything she could see. The tail number was barely visible through corrosion and aquatic growth, but she could make out enough digits to know this would be traceable. 44 12847. Her hands shook as she photographed the markings, knowing that somewhere in military archives, this number would tell a story. But it was when she worked her way closer to the cockpit area that Sarah's world tilted off its axis. Floating in the pilot's compartment, preserved by the cold water and lack of oxygen, was a leather flight jacket. And pinned to that jacket was a set of dog tags that caught the filtered sunlight streaming down into the canyon. Sarah didn't need to read the tags to know what they would say. Something deep in her chest, some intuition that went beyond logic, told her that her 3-day search for Ranger had led her to something impossible, something that would answer questions she'd carried her entire life. With trembling fingers, she reached into the water and carefully removed the dog tags from the skeletal remains. The metal was tarnished, but still legible. Lut, William J. Mitchell, 42 to 78394 B. Below that, in smaller letters, Protestant, Type O, next of kin, Margaret Mitchell, Denver, T.O. The world seemed to stop spinning. Sarah stared at the tags, reading the name over and over again, her mind struggling to process what she was seeing. Mitchell. William Mitchell. Her mother's name had been Margaret Mitchell, maiden name Hartwell. She had lived in Denver before moving to Colorado Springs when Sarah was born. This was her father. After 40 years of wondering, of imagining, of creating stories to fill the void where a parent should have been, she was holding proof of his existence in her hands. He hadn't abandoned her and her mother. He had died serving his country, probably before he even knew he had a daughter. Ranger whined softly from the shore, as if sensing the magnitude of what Sarah had discovered. She looked at her loyal companion through tears she didn't remember shedding, understanding now why he had led her here. Somehow, in ways that defied explanation, this place had called to both of them. But even as relief and grief washed over her in equal measure, questions multiplied in Sarah's mind. What was her father's bomber doing in a hidden canyon in Colorado? Why were there no official records of a crash here? And most importantly, what secrets had died with the crew of aircraft 44 12847? The journey back to civilization felt like emerging from a dream into harsh reality. Sarah clutched her father's dog tags in one hand while Ranger trotted beside her, both of them forever changed by what they'd discovered in that hidden canyon. The 40-year mystery of her father's identity had been solved in the most unexpected way possible, but the answers only led to deeper questions that gnawed at her mind with each step toward home. Back in her cabin, Sarah spread the photographs across her kitchen table like pieces of a puzzle that refused to make sense. The tail number 44 12847 glowed from her phone screen, and she carefully copied it into a notebook along with every detail she could remember about the crash site. Her father's dog tags lay beside the notebook, the metal still cold from the mountain lake, tangible proof that William Jaden Mitchell had been real, had lived, had died far from home. Her first instinct was to call the local authorities, but something held her back. Sheriff Tom Bradley was a good man and a friend, but this felt bigger than small-town law enforcement could handle. This was military history, possibly classified information, and Sarah's years in the Army had taught her that sensitive discoveries could disappear quickly if the wrong people got involved. Instead, she turned to her laptop and began researching. The ancient machine wheezed to life, connecting to the satellite internet that was her only link to the outside world. Her search for B-24 Bomber 44-12847 returned exactly nothing. No crash records, no mission reports, no mention of the aircraft anywhere in the publicly available databases. It was as if the plane had never existed, but Sarah knew better than to trust official records. Her own military service had taught her that not everything made it into the history books, especially when it came to classified operations or embarrassing failures. She expanded her search, looking for B-24 bombers that had gone missing in October 1944, the time frame that seemed to match the aircraft's configuration and condition. That's when she found the first breadcrumb, a brief mention in a declassified Air Force document about Operation Nightfall, a series of classified missions flown in late 1944. The details were heavily redacted, but the document mentioned several aircraft that had been lost over the Pacific during the operation. No crew names were listed, no specific aircraft numbers, but the timing was right. Digging deeper, Sarah discovered Dr. Rebecca Hayes, a military historian at the Air Force Academy in Colorado Springs, who specialized in World War II aviation mysteries. Her academic papers detailed several cases of aircraft that had officially crashed in one location, but had actually gone down elsewhere, usually due to navigation errors or weather conditions that had forced pilots off their planned routes. Sarah crafted a careful email to Dr. Hayes, providing the tail number and basic details about finding the aircraft in a remote location. She didn't mention the personal connection or the exact location. Not yet. Within hours, her phone rang. "Miss Mitchell, this is Dr. Hayes from the Air Force Academy. Your email about aircraft 44-12847 has caught my attention for reasons I can't discuss over the phone. Would it be possible to meet in person? This is extremely important." The urgency in the historian's voice sent chills down Sarah's spine. She agreed to meet the next day at a coffee shop in Colorado Springs, halfway between her cabin and the academy. Something about Dr. Hayes's tone suggested that this discovery was more significant than even Sarah had imagined. That night, Sarah couldn't sleep. She lay in bed with Ranger curled up beside her, turning her father's dog tags over and over in her hands. The metal had warmed to her body temperature, and she found herself imagining the young pilot who had worn them, the man who had loved her mother enough to list her as next of kin, but had died before he could come home to meet his daughter. The meeting with Dr. Hayes changed everything. The historian was a sharp-eyed woman in her mid-40s who carried herself with the confident bearing of someone accustomed to uncovering secrets. She listened intently as Sarah described the discovery, occasionally asking pointed questions about the aircraft's condition and position. When Sarah finally produced the dog tags, Dr. Hayes's professional composure cracked. "My God," she whispered, handling the tags like religious relics. "Do you understand what you've found? Lieutenant William Mitchell was the pilot of a B-24 that disappeared during one of the most classified missions of World War II. The official record states that his aircraft was lost over the Pacific Ocean with all hands, but if you found him in Colorado—" Dr. Hayes paused, seeming to weigh her words carefully. "Miss Mitchell, Operation Nightfall wasn't what the public records suggest. These bombers weren't conducting routine missions. They were involved in something much more sensitive, something that certain people have worked very hard to keep buried." She went on to explain that Operation Nightfall had been designed as a series of long-range reconnaissance flights over Japanese-held territory in the Pacific. But according to her research, several of the aircraft had been diverted to different missions at the last minute, missions that never appeared in any official records. The fact that one of these planes had crashed in Colorado suggested that whatever they were doing, it wasn't taking place over the Pacific. "There's someone you need to meet," Dr. Hayes said, pulling out her phone. Eleanor Thompson is 78 years old and lives in an assisted living facility in Denver. She's been searching for information about her husband for 80 years. Her husband was Lieutenant William Mitchell. Sarah's world tilted again. Her father had been married to someone else. The woman listed as his next of kin on the dog tags had been his wife, not just Sarah's mother. The revelation hit her like a physical blow, raising questions about her own legitimacy and her mother's relationship with William Mitchell. But Dr. Hayes wasn't finished. Eleanor was a war bride, married to your father just weeks before he shipped out for his final mission. She never remarried, never stopped believing that someday she'd learn what really happened to him. When I called her an hour ago and told her we might have found William's aircraft, she asked me to bring her to meet you immediately. The drive to Denver passed in a blur of conflicting emotions. Sarah found herself about to meet her father's widow, a woman who had been mourning the same man Sarah had been wondering about her entire life. Ranger sensed her distress and kept his massive head pressed against her leg during the entire journey, offering the wordless comfort that had sustained them both through their darkest moments. Eleanor Thompson was nothing like Sarah had imagined. Despite her advanced age, she moved with quiet dignity and possessed eyes that held depths of sorrow and strength accumulated over 8 decades of living. When she saw the dog tags, she began to cry. Not the desperate sobs of fresh grief, but the quiet tears of someone who had finally found the answer to a question that had defined her entire adult life. I knew William for 6 weeks before he left for his mission, Eleanor said, her voice still carrying traces of the British accent that had marked her as a war bride. 6 weeks of marriage, and then 80 years of wondering. He told me he was flying dangerous missions, but he never said where or why. The last letter I received from him was postmarked from Colorado, not California, where he was supposedly stationed. I always wondered why. She reached into her purse and withdrew a small bundle of letters tied with a faded ribbon. These are the only things I have left of our time together. Perhaps they'll help you understand what kind of man your father was. As Sarah read through the letters, a picture emerged of a young pilot who had been deeply troubled by his final mission. William wrote cryptically about orders that didn't sit right and a crew that was beginning to ask questions. His last letter, dated just days before the crash, mentioned that they were carrying cargo that shouldn't exist and flying routes that made no military sense. He knew something was wrong, Eleanor said quietly. I could tell from his letters that he was scared, not of dying in combat, but of what his own command was asking him to do. The last time we spoke on the phone, he said something I've never forgotten. Sometimes a soldier has to choose between following orders and doing what's right. Dr. Hayes had been listening intently to their conversation, and now she leaned forward with the expression of someone who had just solved a complex puzzle. I think I know what Operation Nightfall really was, she said. And if I'm right, your father and his crew died because they chose to do the right thing instead of following orders that would have cost hundreds of lives. The 3 women sat in Eleanor's small apartment as the sun set over Denver, united by their connection to a man who had died 8 decades ago, but whose story was finally beginning to emerge from the shadows of official secrecy. Sarah realized that finding her father's aircraft was only the beginning. Now she needed to discover what William Mitchell had died trying to protect, and why powerful people had worked so hard to keep that truth buried. But first, she had to return to the canyon and retrieve the evidence that would prove her father was a hero, not just another casualty of war. The return expedition to the hidden canyon 3 days later felt like a military operation, which in many ways it was. Sarah, Dr. Hayes, Eleanor, and Sheriff Tom Bradley formed an unlikely alliance united by their determination to uncover the truth about Operation Nightfall. Eleanor had insisted on coming despite her age, declaring that she'd waited 80 years to learn what happened to her husband and wasn't about to miss the final chapter. Tom Bradley had been skeptical until Sarah showed him the dog tags and Dr. Hayes explained the historical significance of the discovery. As the county sheriff, he understood the legal implications of disturbing what was essentially a crash site and potential war grave. But he also recognized that this discovery could rewrite military history, and he wasn't about to let federal bureaucrats sweep it under the rug without proper documentation. They hiked into the canyon at dawn, carrying professional photography equipment, metal detectors, and waterproof containers for evidence recovery. Ranger led the way with the confidence of a dog returning to familiar territory, occasionally looking back to ensure the slower-moving humans were keeping up. Eleanor moved carefully but determinedly, refusing assistance even when the terrain became challenging. The morning light transformed the hidden lake into something magical. Mist rose from the water's surface, and the submerged bomber looked like a sleeping leviathan in the crystal-clear depths. Dr. Hayes immediately began photographing everything, documenting the site with the methodical precision of a trained archaeologist. The historian's excitement was palpable as she recorded GPS coordinates and measured the aircraft's position relative to the canyon walls. "This is remarkable preservation," she murmured, adjusting her camera settings to capture the details of the fuselage visible beneath the water. "The cold temperature and lack of oxygen have kept everything virtually intact. We're looking at a time capsule from 1944. Sarah waded back into the frigid water, this time better prepared with a wetsuit borrowed from the local search and rescue team. Her military training and underwater recovery proved invaluable as she carefully explored the bomber's interior. In the navigator's compartment, she discovered a waterproof map case that had somehow remained sealed for 8 decades. The maps inside the case told a story that contradicted everything in the official records. Instead of showing flight paths over the Pacific, these charts detailed routes across the continental United States with specific waypoints marked in Colorado, Utah, and Nevada. Handwritten notes in the margins indicated fuel stops and cargo pickup points that had nothing to do with combat missions against Japan. But it was the discovery in the bomb bay that changed everything. Where high-explosive ordnance should have been mounted, Sarah found the remains of wooden crates marked with Red Cross symbols. The International Red Cross markings were clear despite decades underwater, and the size and configuration of the cargo area suggested these bombers had been converted for humanitarian transport rather than combat missions. Eleanor's gasp echoed across the water when Sarah surfaced with photographic evidence of the Red Cross cargo. The elderly woman had been watching from the shoreline, her eyes fixed on every movement in the water where her husband's remains lay. "He told me in his last letter that they were carrying hope for people who had given up hope," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I never understood what he meant until now, Doctor." Hayes studied the photographs with growing excitement and horror. "These aircraft weren't conducting reconnaissance missions," she said, her academic composure cracking. "They were running humanitarian supply drops to Allied prisoners of war and civilians in Japanese-occupied territory. But if they were flying supply missions, why are the official records claiming they were lost over the Pacific during combat operations?" The answer came when Sheriff Bradley discovered something that made everyone's blood run cold. Using his metal detector along the shoreline, he'd located pieces of the bomber's radio equipment that had been thrown clear during the crash. The radio bore evidence of deliberate sabotage, wires that had been cut, not damaged by impact. "Someone didn't want this crew to communicate their position," Bradley said grimly, examining the severed cables. "These cuts were made with a knife or wire cutters, not torn by crash forces. This aircraft was sabotaged." As the day progressed and more evidence emerged, a horrifying picture began to take shape. Operation Nightfall hadn't been a legitimate military mission that had gone wrong. It had been a deliberate betrayal of air crews who had volunteered for dangerous humanitarian missions. Someone in the chain of command had wanted these bombers to disappear, along with any evidence of the unauthorized mercy flights they were conducting. Sarah found the final piece of the puzzle in her father's personal effects, preserved in a waterproof pouch he'd carried in his flight jacket. Among the items was a small notebook containing what appeared to be a crew manifest for multiple aircraft. The names included not just aircrew members, but civilians, doctors, nurses, and relief workers who had been secretly transported into Japanese-held territory to provide medical care for prisoners and civilian casualties. "My God," Dr. Hayes breathed as she read through the notebook. This wasn't just about supply drops. They were running an underground railroad to get medical personnel into the Pacific Theater. Someone at the highest levels of command ordered these aircraft destroyed to cover up an unauthorized humanitarian operation. Eleanor's hands shook as she held one of the photographs showing her husband's preserved uniform. William always said he joined the Army Air Forces to save lives, not take them. He must have volunteered for these missions knowing how dangerous they were. But their moment of historical discovery was shattered by the sound of helicopters approaching the canyon. Sheriff Bradley immediately reached for his radio, but before he could call for backup, armed figures in military fatigues appeared on the canyon rim above them. The black helicopters circled like mechanical vultures, and tactical teams began rappelling down ropes into their hidden sanctuary. "Federal agents!" an amplified voice boomed across the water. "This is a restricted military site. Everyone exit the water immediately and prepare for detention." The lead agent who approached their group was a tall, imposing man in his mid-50s who carried himself with the bearing of a career military officer. His uniform bore the insignia of a colonel, but no name tags or unit identification. Behind him, a dozen armed soldiers spread out in a defensive perimeter, their weapons not quite pointed at the civilians, but clearly ready for action. "I am Colonel James Hartwell," the man announced, his voice carrying absolute authority. "This crash site has been classified as a matter of national security. All evidence, photographs, and materials recovered from this location are hereby confiscated under the provisions of the National Defense Authorization Act." Dr. Hayes stepped forward, her academic credentials giving her confidence to challenge military authority. "Colonel, this is a historical site of immense significance. The academic community has every right to study and document these findings under the Archaeological Resources Protection Act." Hartwell's cold smile never reached his eyes. "Doctor, I'm afraid you misunderstand the situation. This site contains classified information that remains sensitive to national security even after 80 years. Your little expedition ends here." But it was Eleanor who provided the most shocking moment of the confrontation. The elderly woman stared at Colonel Hartwell with growing recognition, her face cycling through emotions of disbelief, hope, and finally, devastation. "James?" she whispered, her voice carrying across the suddenly silent canyon. "James Hartwell. You're William's son from his first marriage. You're my stepson." The colonel's military composure cracked for just an instant, revealing a depth of pain and anger that had been buried for decades. "Hello, Eleanor. Yes, I'm William Mitchell's son, and I've spent my entire career making sure that his betrayal of military discipline never sees the light of day." The family reunion that should have been joyful became a confrontation that would determine whether the truth about Operation Nightfall would finally be revealed or buried forever, along with the heroes who had died trying to save lives rather than take them. Sarah found herself caught between two family members she'd never known existed, with her father's legacy hanging in the balance and armed soldiers surrounding the hidden canyon where Lieutenant William Mitchell had made his final sacrifice for the cause of human compassion. The confrontation between Eleanor and Colonel Hartwell transformed the hidden canyon into an emotional battlefield where decades of buried pain and resentment finally erupted into the open. Sarah watched in stunned silence as her newfound stepbrother's military composure completely disintegrated, revealing a man consumed by a lifetime of anger toward the father he'd never truly known. Betrayal? Eleanor's voice cracked with 8 decades of suppressed grief and sudden fury. "James, your father died trying to save lives. How can you call that betrayal?" Hartwell's face contorted with rage that had been festering for 80 years. "He abandoned his first family for you. He left my mother and me to chase some romantic fantasy with a British war bride, and then he got himself killed playing hero instead of following orders that would have brought him home alive." The personal revelation hit Sarah like a physical blow. Not only had her father been married before, but he'd had a son, her half-brother, who had grown up believing that William Mitchell had chosen another family over his first one. The complexity of the family dynamics made her head spin, but the immediate danger from the armed soldiers surrounding them kept her focused on survival. Dr. Hayes tried to maintain academic objectivity in the face of military intimidation. "Colonel Hartwell, regardless of personal family issues, this site represents invaluable historical evidence. The American people have a right to know about Operation Nightfall and the humanitarian missions that cost these aircrews their lives." "The American people have a right to national security," Hartwell snapped back, his colonel's authority reasserting itself. "These missions were unauthorized, illegal, and compromised military discipline during wartime. My father and his Bleeding Heart crew violated direct orders and got themselves killed for nothing. The enemy prisoners they were trying to save died anyway, and their actions could have compromised legitimate military operations." Sheriff Bradley stepped forward, his hand resting on his service weapon. "Colonel, I don't care what your family drama is about, but you're on county land with no federal warrant. These people have every right to document historical discoveries, and I won't have them intimidated by federal overreach." The tension escalated when Ranger, sensing the threat to Sarah, positioned himself between the soldiers and his human family. The dog's low growl carried a warning that anyone with military experience would recognize. This was a trained attack dog prepared to defend his pack. Several soldiers shifted their grip on their weapons, and Sarah realized the situation was about to explode into violence. But it was Eleanor who diffused the immediate crisis with words that cut through the military posturing like a knife through armor. "James, I have something you need to see. Something your father left for you before his final mission." She reached into her purse and withdrew a sealed envelope that looked as old as the bomber itself. The paper was yellowed with age, but the ink was still legible. "For my son James to be opened only if I don't come home. W. Mitchell." Hartwell stared at the letter as if it were a live grenade. For a moment the colonel disappeared, and only the abandoned son remained. A man who had spent his entire life believing his father had chosen another family over him. "Where did you get this?" "It was in the last package your father sent me before his final mission," Eleanor said gently, "along with letters for you and your mother. I've been waiting 80 years for the chance to deliver them." The colonel's hands trembled as he took the envelope. Sarah watched her half-brother's face cycle through decades of emotions as he read their father's final words to his firstborn son. The letter was brief, but its impact was devastating. William Mitchell had explained that his marriage to Eleanor had been a wartime mistake, born of loneliness and fear, but that he had never stopped loving his first family. He'd taken the dangerous humanitarian missions, hoping to earn enough commendation to request a transfer back to the States, back to James and his mother. "He was coming home to us," Hartwell whispered, his voice breaking. "He took these missions to get back to us, not to abandon us." But the family reconciliation was interrupted by a new crisis that changed everything. One of Hartwell's soldiers came running from the communications equipment they'd set up on the canyon rim, his face pale with urgency. "Sir, we have a problem. Headquarters is ordering immediate site sterilization. They want everything destroyed within the hour." The meaning was clear to everyone present. Site sterilization meant not just destroying the evidence, but eliminating the witnesses who had discovered it. Sarah felt ice-cold terror flood her veins as she realized that powerful people in Washington were prepared to commit murder to keep Operation Nightfall buried. Dr. Hayes grabbed her camera equipment, frantically trying to upload her photographs to cloud storage before they could be confiscated. "This is exactly what happened 80 years ago. They're going to cover up the truth again and kill anyone who tries to expose it." Hartwell found himself caught between a lifetime of military obedience and the devastating realization that he had spent his career protecting the same system that had murdered his father and abandoned humanitarian heroes to die in silence. The colonel looked around the canyon, at Eleanor, the woman his father had loved, at Sarah, the half-sister he'd never known existed, at the bomber that held the remains of the man he'd spent 8 decades hating and had just learned to love. "Stand down," he ordered his troops. "All of you, stand down immediately." "Sir?" The sergeant in charge of the tactical team looked confused. "Headquarters ordered site sterilization. We have our orders." "I'm giving you new orders," Hartwell said, his voice carrying the authority of a career officer who had finally found something worth fighting for. "Secure the perimeter. No one gets in or out, but no harm comes to these civilians. That's a direct order." The radio crackled with angry demands from headquarters, threatening court-martial and prosecution for disobeying federal directives. But Hartwell calmly removed his radio and threw it into the lake where it sank beside his father's bomber. 80 years ago, my father chose to disobey orders because saving lives was more important than military discipline," he said, looking directly at Sarah. "Today, I'm making the same choice. These people deserve to know the truth about the heroes who died trying to save lives instead of take them." But their moment of triumph was shattered when the sound of additional helicopters filled the canyon. These weren't military aircraft. They were news helicopters, drawn by reports of federal activity in the remote wilderness. Someone had leaked word of the discovery to the media, and now the whole world was about to learn about Operation Nightfall. Eleanor collapsed to her knees beside the water where her husband's remains lay, finally overcome by the emotional toll of the day. "William," she whispered to the submerged bomber, "your secret is finally safe. The truth is going to come out." But as Sarah knelt beside the elderly woman, she noticed something terrifying. Eleanor's lips were turning blue, and her breathing was becoming labored. The stress and exertion of the day had triggered what appeared to be a major cardiac event. At 78 years old, in the middle of a remote canyon with no medical facilities, Eleanor Thompson was dying. The woman who had waited 8 decades to learn the truth about her husband's death was about to die herself, just moments after finally discovering that William Mitchell had been a hero rather than a deserter. Sarah, drawing on her Army medic training, began administering CPR while screaming for someone to call for emergency medical evacuation. As news helicopters circled overhead and Eleanor fought for her life, Sarah realized that the discovery of Operation Nightfall had cost them everything. They had found the truth, but they were about to lose the one person who could tell the world what it really meant to love someone enough to wait a lifetime for answers. The hidden canyon that had kept its secrets for 80 years was about to become the site of another tragedy, unless a miracle could save the woman who had spent her entire adult life mourning a hero she had finally learned to love all over again. The emergency medical helicopter arrived at the canyon just as Eleanor's heartbeat flatlined under Sarah's desperate CPR efforts. The paramedics rappelled down with equipment that looked impossibly modern against the backdrop of the 1944 bomber, creating a surreal juxtaposition of past and present that seemed to capture the entire impossible situation they found themselves in. "She's in full cardiac arrest," the lead paramedic announced as he took over from Sarah's exhausted efforts. "How long has she been down?" 4 minutes, maybe 5, Sarah gasped, her hands cramping from the chest compressions she'd been performing while Ranger whined anxiously beside Eleanor's still form. The irony wasn't lost on her that they had finally uncovered the truth about her father's heroic death, just in time to watch his widow die from the shock of the revelation. The paramedics worked with professional efficiency, injecting medications and applying defibrillator pads while Colonel Hartwell coordinated the evacuation with military precision. The news helicopters circled overhead like mechanical vultures, their cameras capturing every moment of the medical emergency while reporters speculated about the nature of the federal operation in the remote canyon. Eleanor's eyes fluttered open just as they were preparing to airlift her to Denver General Hospital. Her first whispered words were, "Did we save William's story?" The paramedic tried to quiet her, but she gripped Sarah's hand with surprising strength. "Promise me, child. Promise me the world will know he was a hero." "I promise," Sarah said, tears streaming down her face as she watched the medical team prepare Eleanor for transport. "The whole world will know." But even as the medical helicopter lifted Eleanor toward the canyon rim, Sarah could see federal vehicles racing along the mountain roads toward their location. Someone in Washington had decided that Operation Nightfall needed to stay buried, regardless of the cost in human lives. The race between truth and cover-up had begun in earnest. Dr. Hayes had managed to upload several dozen photographs to cloud storage before the soldiers confiscated her equipment, but she knew it wouldn't be enough to prove their case against determined federal opposition. "We need more evidence," she told Sarah urgently. "Physical proof that can't be dismissed or explained away." That's when Ranger provided the solution in the most unexpected way. The German Shepherd had been agitated throughout the medical emergency, pacing the shoreline and whining constantly. But now, he was focused on something specific, pawing at a section of the lake bottom where debris from the bomber had settled over the decades. Sarah followed the dog's lead and dove into the frigid water one last time. In the silt beneath the aircraft's broken wing, her fingers found something that made her heart race. A sealed metal cylinder about the size of a large thermos. The cylinder bore military markings and was clearly designed to be waterproof. Inside, protected from 8 decades of submersion, was a complete mission briefing for Operation Nightfall. The documents revealed the shocking truth that Dr. Hayes had only suspected. Operation Nightfall hadn't been a rogue humanitarian mission conducted by Bleeding Heart air crews acting against orders. It had been officially authorized at the highest levels of the War Department, approved by generals who understood that winning the war meant more than just defeating the enemy militarily. It meant preserving American values of compassion and human dignity. But the operation had been betrayed by a small group of officers who believed that mercy was weakness and that unauthorized compassion compromised military discipline. These officers had systematically sabotaged the humanitarian flights, ensuring that the aircraft disappeared without trace, while blaming navigation errors and enemy action for the losses. The final document in the cylinder was a list of names, not just the aircrew members who had died, but the corrupt officers who had murdered them. Several of those names belonged to men who had gone on to distinguished post-war careers in the military-industrial complex, building fortunes on the foundation of wartime betrayal. "This is it," Dr. Hayes breathed as she read through the documents. "This is the smoking gun that proves Operation Nightfall was murdered, not lost. and some of the men responsible are still alive. But their triumph was short-lived. Colonel Hartwell's radio crackled with urgent messages from his remaining loyal troops positioned around the canyon rim. "Sir, we have multiple federal agencies converging on this location, FBI, CIA, and some others we can't identify. They're demanding immediate access to the site." The colonel looked around the canyon at the small group of civilians who had uncovered one of the darkest secrets in American military history. "They're not here to investigate," he said grimly. "They're here to clean up. Everyone who knows about Operation Nightfall represents a threat to people with enough power to make us all disappear." Sheriff Bradley was already on his radio, calling for backup from every law enforcement agency in the state. "This is going to be a federal versus local jurisdictional nightmare," he told Sarah. "But I'll be damned if I let them disappear American citizens on my watch." The next few hours turned the hidden canyon into a three-way standoff between federal agents, local law enforcement, and news media who had caught wind of the story. Colonel Hartwell found himself in the impossible position of choosing between his military oath and his conscience, while Sarah clutched the evidence that could expose decades of government cover-ups. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Dr. Hayes had been frantically making phone calls on her satellite phone, and she finally reached someone with enough influence to matter. Senator Patricia Williams, the ranking member of the Senate Armed Services Committee and a veteran herself who had built her political career on government transparency. "Senator Williams is demanding a full congressional investigation," Dr. Hayes announced. "She's threatening to hold immediate hearings if anyone interferes with this historical site or the people who discovered it." But the federal agents weren't backing down. The lead agent, a cold-eyed man who introduced himself only as Director Morrison, made it clear that national security trumped congressional oversight. "This site contains classified information that could compromise ongoing operations. Everyone present will be detained pending security clearance reviews." The confrontation reached its climax when a new helicopter arrived. Not military or federal, but a civilian aircraft carrying someone who changed the entire dynamic of the situation. Eleanor Thompson had discharged herself from the hospital against medical advice and returned to the canyon where her husband's story was finally being told. Despite her obvious frailty and the portable oxygen tank she now required, Eleanor's presence transformed the standoff. The 78-year-old woman who had waited 8 decades for answers walked directly up to Director Morrison and spoke with the quiet authority of someone who had nothing left to lose. "Young man," she said, her voice carrying clearly across the canyon, "I have been waiting 80 years to learn the truth about my husband's death. I am not going to let you bury him in lies for another 80 years. You can arrest me, you can threaten me, but you cannot make me forget what we discovered here today." The media helicopters caught every word, broadcasting Eleanor's defiant stand to a nation that was rapidly becoming invested in the story of the war widow who refused to let her husband's heroism be erased by government cover-ups. Public opinion, powered by social media and 24-hour news coverage, began shifting decisively in favor of the truth-seekers. But it was Ranger who provided the final, most dramatic moment of the confrontation. As federal agents moved to arrest Sarah and confiscate the remaining evidence, the German Shepherd positioned himself between the agents and his human family. The dog's protective stance and low growl created a powerful visual that the news cameras captured in perfect detail. A loyal military working dog defending the truth about American heroes against the very government they had died serving. The image of Ranger protecting Sarah while she held her father's dog tags went viral within hours, creating a national conversation about loyalty, sacrifice, and the price of truth. The federal agents found themselves facing not just local resistance, but a growing public relations disaster that threatened to expose far more than just Operation Nightfall. Director Morrison made one final attempt to control the situation. This operation is classified at the highest levels. Revealing these details could compromise national security and endanger American lives. But Colonel Hartwell had heard enough. Director, I've spent my entire career following orders and protecting classified operations. But some truths are more important than classification levels. My father and his crew died because they chose to save lives instead of follow orders that would have let innocent people die. Today I'm making the same choice. He turned to face the news cameras that were broadcasting live to the nation. My name is Colonel James Hartwell, and I want to tell you about Operation Nightfall, a humanitarian mission that was murdered by corruption and covered up by cowardice. The heroes who died in this canyon deserve better than secrecy and lies. As the sun set over the hidden canyon, Sarah realized that they had won more than just the right to tell her father's story. They had proven that truth, loyalty, and courage could still triumph over power and corruption, and that sometimes the most important battles are fought not with weapons, but with the simple refusal to let heroes be forgotten. But the cost of victory was becoming clear. Eleanor's heart was failing, and the elderly woman who had waited a lifetime for answers might not live to see her husband finally honored as the hero he had always been. 6 months after the discovery that changed American military history, Sarah Mitchell stood before the restored bomber in the National Museum of the United States Air Force, watching as hundreds of visitors learned the true story of Operation Nightfall. The B-24 Liberator had been carefully raised from its Mountain Lake tomb and lovingly restored to honor the crew that had died trying to save lives rather than take them. Eleanor Thompson sat in a place of honor at the dedication ceremony, her portable oxygen tank a reminder of how close they had come to losing her voice along with her husband's story. At 79, she had defied her doctor's predictions and lived to see William Mitchell honored as a hero rather than remembered as a missing statistic. The Congressional Medal of Honor, posthumously awarded to Lieutenant Mitchell and his crew, hung in a place of prominence beside the aircraft, finally recognizing the courage it had taken to disobey orders in service of human compassion. "Ladies and gentlemen," the museum director announced to the gathered crowd, "please welcome Sarah Mitchell, daughter of Lieutenant William Mitchell, who will dedicate the Operation Nightfall Memorial." Sarah approached the microphone with Ranger at her side, the German Shepherd wearing a special harness identifying him as the dog who had led rescuers to the hidden canyon. The loyal animal had become something of a national celebrity, his story of finding the lost aircraft inspiring legislation that improved medical care and retirement benefits for military working dogs across the country. "My father died before I was born," Sarah began, her voice carrying clearly through the museum's soaring space. "For 40 years I believed he had abandoned my mother and me. I carried that pain like a wound that never healed, wondering what kind of man could walk away from his family without a backward glance." She paused, looking up at the restored bomber that had become a symbol of courage and sacrifice. "But Ranger led me to the truth. My father didn't abandon us. He died trying to save people he'd never met, in a place he'd never been, because he believed that every life had value. Lieutenant William Mitchell and his crew weren't just following orders. They were following their hearts." The audience included families of the other crew members who had died with William Mitchell, people who had spent decades wondering about their own lost relatives. Dr. Rebecca Hayes had spent months tracking down descendants and sharing the evidence that proved their loved ones had been heroes, not casualties of navigation errors or enemy action. Eleanor rose slowly from her wheelchair, supported by a walker, but determined to speak for herself. The crowd fell silent as the elderly woman approached the microphone, her voice still carrying traces of the British accent that marked her as a war bride from another era. "I want to thank Sarah for giving an old woman the greatest gift imaginable," Eleanor said, her words carefully measured but filled with emotion. "For 80 years, I wondered if my husband had loved me enough to come home. Now I know that he loved me so much that he was willing to die for the values that brought us together. William didn't just wear the uniform, he lived the oath." The ceremony continued with remarks from Senator Patricia Williams, whose congressional investigation had exposed the corruption that had led to Operation Nightfall's cover-up. 3 retired military officers had been stripped of their honors and faced federal prosecution for their roles in the betrayal, while the families of the Operation Nightfall crews received full military benefits and official apologies for decades of government lies. But the most meaningful moment came when Colonel James Hartwell, now retired and working as a military historian, approached the memorial wall that listed the names of all the people Lieutenant Mitchell's crew had died trying to save. The man who had spent his career protecting classified operations had found his true calling in exposing the truth about his father's heroism. "I wasted 55 years hating a man I should have been proud to call my father," he said, placing his hand on William Mitchell's name etched in black granite. "But Sarah and Ranger showed me that it's never too late to learn the truth about the people we love." The dedication ceremony concluded with the unveiling of a special exhibit about military working dogs, featuring Ranger's story and highlighting the bond between service members and their canine companions. Children pressed against the display cases, reading about the German Shepherd who had led his human family to one of the most important historical discoveries of the modern era. As the crowd dispersed, Sarah found herself alone with Eleanor and Ranger in front of the restored bomber. The elderly woman moved slowly but steadily, her eyes fixed on the aircraft that had become her husband's monument. "He would have loved knowing about you," Eleanor said, reaching out to touch Sarah's hand. "William always said he wanted to be remembered for saving lives, not taking them. Thanks to you and this remarkable dog, that's exactly how he'll be remembered." Sarah knelt beside Ranger, scratching behind the ears of the dog who had changed everything. The German Shepherd had fully recovered from his bullet wound and had even sired a litter of puppies that were being trained as therapy dogs for veterans suffering from PTSD. His legacy would live on in the service dogs that helped wounded warriors heal, just as he had helped Sarah find her way home. The Mitchell-Thompson Foundation, established with Sarah's lawsuit settlement money, had already placed over 200 retired military working dogs with veteran families, creating bonds that helped both species recover from the invisible wounds of war. Eleanor served as the foundation's honorary chairwoman, her apartment filled with photos of successful placements and thank you letters from grateful veterans. "You know what the best part is?" Sarah said, looking up at the bomber that no longer seemed like a tomb, but rather a symbol of hope. "Dad's mission finally succeeded. He wanted to save lives, and through this foundation he's still saving lives every day." As they walked toward the museum exit, Sarah noticed a young girl tugging on her mother's sleeve, pointing at Ranger with obvious excitement. "Mommy, is that the hero dog who found the airplane?" Sarah smiled and knelt down to the child's level. "His name is Ranger, and yes, he's definitely a hero. But you know what makes him special? He never gave up, even when things seemed impossible. Sometimes the most important thing you can do is keep looking for the truth, even when everyone tells you to stop." The little girl reached out tentatively to pet Ranger, who accepted the attention with the patient dignity that had made him a perfect therapy dog. "Will he find more airplanes?" "Maybe," Sarah said, standing as the girl's mother smiled her thanks. "But right now, he's helping other veterans find their way home, just like he helped me find mine." Outside the museum, Sarah and Eleanor sat on a bench in the late afternoon sunshine, watching families explore the outdoor aircraft displays. Ranger dozed contentedly at their feet, his healing presence a bridge between the past and the future. Some love stories take 80 years to finish writing, Eleanor said, echoing the words that had become the Foundation's motto. But they're worth every year of waiting. Sarah nodded, fingering the dog tags she now wore alongside her own military identification. Dad led us all home, didn't he? Even from beyond the grave. A dog led her to her father. A father led her to her purpose. Purpose led her home. But love, the love between humans and animals, between families separated by time and tragedy, between people who refused to let heroes be forgotten, love brought them all together, creating a legacy that would endure long after the last veteran had come home. Dear friends, Sarah Mitchell's story reminds us that it's never too late to discover the truth about the people we love, and that sometimes our greatest treasures are hidden in the most unexpected places. Like many of you, Sarah spent decades carrying questions about her family, wondering about a father she never knew, struggling with feelings of abandonment that shaped her entire life. But through the loyalty of a faithful German shepherd named Ranger, she discovered that her father wasn't the man who abandoned her, but a hero who died saving others. At 52, Sarah learned that the pain she'd carried for 40 years was based on a lie, and that the truth, though it came late, could still heal wounds that seemed permanent. This story speaks to every one of us who has wondered about our parents' choices, questioned whether we were truly loved, or felt the weight of family secrets that were never explained. Sometimes the answers we need most come through the most unexpected messengers: a loyal dog, a hidden canyon, or the courage to keep searching when everyone else has given up. The love that defines us doesn't diminish with time. It grows stronger when we finally understand its true meaning. What family mysteries or unanswered questions have shaped your own life story? Have you ever discovered that something you believed about a loved one for years turned out to be completely different from the truth? Please share your thoughts and experiences in the comments below. Your story might be exactly what someone else needs to hear today.